race doesn't limit you from anything.
all about
I feel
identity.
like they learn about race from, I teach them
Can even
about
aspire
race,
to
about
who you are with somebody else that looks like you.
And love who you
to
are.
love
racial
themselves.
identity.
Greetings and welcome to a new season of the P.R.I.D.E Programs podcast, In My Skin, where we explore the intersection of race and early childhood. I'm your new host, Medina Jackson, the Director of Engagement for the P.R.I.D.E program. First, I want to give a huge shout out to Adam Flango, the former host and creator of the In My Skin podcast, who has created all of the content of prior seasons. If you haven't already listened to those dynamic, informative episodes, make sure that you do so. We thank you, our listeners, for your support thus far. This season, we will be highlighting scholars and practitioners who are in active practice of implementing P.R.I.D.E strategies because we want you to hear directly from those who are doing solution-oriented work and doing it well. In these episodes, our guests will be in conversation with me as they not only share their professional knowledge and passion, but their lived experiences that brought them to the work they do. Here at P.R.I.D.E, we know this work is just as much personal as professional and that our children's lives depend on it. We are here to disrupt the impact of racism through positive, holistic strategies that may inspire you to try something new in your classrooms, homes, and community spaces. This episode provides a special treat where I speak with two champions for Black children's education, identity, and justice, my colleague, the amazing Dr. Aisha White, director of the P.R.I.D.E program, and her daughter, Jamilla Rice, a voracious reader, writer, social justice-focused educator, and recipient of the 2009 Milken Family Foundation Teacher of the Year Award for the state of Pennsylvania. There were so many gems shared in this conversation that we didn't want you to miss, that we had to make this a two-part episode. Now, tune in and get to know the learnings, lived experiences, and insights from this dynamic duo, Dr. Aisha White and Jamilla Rice. Welcome to the In My Skin podcast. I am your new host, Medina Jackson. I'm a mom, spoken word artist and poet, creative space maker, community educator, and director of engagement of the P.R.I.D.E program, which stands for Positive Racial Identity Development and Early Education. And I'm really excited to be here with my esteemed colleague, community engaged scholar, practitioner, artist, educator, and director of the P.R.I.D.E program, Dr. Aisha White, and social justice educator, artist, writer, and K-8 assistant to the superintendent for learning and teaching with Chester Community Charter School, Jamilla Rice. Now, one thing you may not know about this dynamic duo is they are also mother and daughter. So I want to welcome you to the show, ladies. So nice to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Medina. This is great.
Yeah,
Sure.
This is great. Yeah, I'm really excited. So we're going to jump right into some questions for you all. So first, as Dr. White knows, when we work with folks in the P.R.I.D.E program, we like to integrate personal reflections about race into the mix. So, we know as much as this work is professional, a large part of our motivation comes from our personal and lived experience with race and racism. So both of you have been engaged in race and justice work in a variety of ways for a long time, from within classrooms and schools to community-based activism. So can you share a lived experience that connects you to and informs your approach to the work that you do? So Dr. White, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, I was going to hand it over to Jamilla first.
You want to get started, Jamilla? Come on with the tag team.
I'm trying to think of something, just off the top of my head, but in terms of a lived experience, it was also a work experience. And that was the work that I did at the Warhol with their Without Sanctuary exhibit. And the Without Sanctuary exhibit was an exhibit on lynching photography in America. And it was originally a collection of postcards and photographs by an antiques dealer. And when he found one of these postcards of a lynching in the drawer of a piece of furniture that he had purchased, he had two thoughts. One was that he could not believe that someone would actually take a photograph of a lynching. And then the second was that he could not believe that someone would mass produce it and turn it into an actual postcard. So the work that I did with the Warhol involved leading discussions related to those visceral images and hearing lots and lots of stories, some of which were family stories that had never been discussed as a family until the family attended that exhibit. So the way that informed, my approach to this is that I learned even more deeply how important true discussion is in order to talk about ideas and be able to connect feelings and experiences to it.
Thank you so much, Jamilla. And can I tell you, I went to that exhibit and I don't think I knew Dr. White at the time. So that's amazing that you were a part of that exhibit. I remember being there at the Warhol and everything, and it was very arresting.
Yeah.
Definitely. So to hear that your brilliant mind was a part of that just makes it even more just amazing.
And what's really funny, funny, right? But what's really funny about that is that I would not have even been in that position if it were not for my response to a new leader at the school where I was teaching at the time, who exhibited a lot of language and behaviors that seemed biased to me. So it was leaving that biased situation that led me into this opportunity to talk about race and state-sponsored terrorism and the perpetuation of these things in society.
Wow. So it's really interesting how the personal and professional experience led to another personal and professional experience that really, I think, informed and engaged so many people about the horrors of lynching. So, kudos to you for that. Dr. White?
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback off of what Jamilla just shared.
Sure.
And the other part of the reason that she was part of that process was because I recommended her.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, Mom.
Come through, Mama.
I always forget.
Yeah, so Malik Bankson was on an advisory group for the exhibit and the community engagement aspect of it. And he called me up and asked me for some recommended people, some educators. And I said, of course, Jamilla. So that's how part of the other reason Jamilla was involved. I thought about it, lived experiences. And so a couple that stand out for me, but I'll just talk in more detail about one of them. One is my work in the 2000s with Rights and Responsibilities, the nonprofit organization that brought in films that help people to better understand the human rights issues impacting people of African descent. But the other, I believe, was my the opportunity I had to go to Nairobi, Kenya in 1985 for part of the United Nations Decade for Women. So back in the 70s and 80s, they used to each 10 years have a international conference of women. And I was lucky enough to be able to go. And the thing that I'll describe that I think connects directly to positive racial identity in particular was landing in Nairobi and deplaning the plane and looking at the bottom of the steps and seeing all Black people. So all of the people who worked at the airport were Black. And I mean, I wouldn't say it was shocking, but it was so impactful. And, I left that experience saying, oh my God, this is what we are missing as African Americans, of people of African descent in the United States. And I think that really, I already was thinking about Black people doing work, being active around it, but I think that really impacted me in a very different kind of way.
Thank you, Dr. White. It's so interesting you mentioned that moment because I have not yet been to the continent, but I always imagine that moment of what I will feel like when I'm stepping off of the plane. So that's, an interesting connection. We are going to talk a little bit about the P.R.I.D.E program for a moment. As you know, our listeners know, the In My Skin podcast is a project out of the P.R.I.D.E program. And I'm not sure, though, that people really know the origin and backstory behind how this program came to be. It's been an official program since 2017, but we've been thinking about positive racial identity since 2015. So, Dr. White, can you share how the P.R.I.D.E program came to be and why this work around race, early childhood, and positive racial identity is so important?
Yeah, so I know that you wanted the abbreviated version, which is really hard for me to do. But I have to start off by giving kudos to two people, Rich Milner, who used to be the head of the Center for Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, and Carol Barone Martin. And the reason is Carol Barone Martin back in 2015 had begun to do some work with some of her early educators around race and racial awareness. Her small group of teachers, they were reading articles, and one of the articles they happened to read was written by Rich Milner, and it was all about his struggle to find quality, diverse childcare for his twin daughters. Carol sent the article to the person who at that time was my supervisor. She shared the article with, at the time, it was our Ready Freddie team, the program that Medina and I coordinated prior to our P.R.I.D.E work. And in her email, she alluded to the fact that there must be some way we can be part of a solution to some of the problems that Dr. Milner had raised in the article. And I had one of those moments where I started to just give her a knee-jerk response and say, yeah, we could do X, Y, Z. And then I instead did some deep thinking and said, I am not going to do that. I am going to tell her what I really think. And that is that there's no way we can be part of the solution as a team when we never, ever, not once talked about race as a team. But I added to that I'm happy to find articles about race in early education, share them with the team, and then have us discuss those articles at our biweekly meetings. And that's what we did for about 6 months. The more we read, the more we realized there was a need for programming to address issues of race and to support children in developing a positive racial identity. One thing led to another. We then got funding to do an environmental scan. The environmental scan report ended up being Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Education, Understanding P.R.I.D.E in Pittsburgh. And from there, we were able to get funding to start our program. So it all started from one single email. And the reason that this work is so important is, one, because young children are seeing race, they are seeing racial differences, and in societies like the United States, and I would also say other places, European countries, for example, that are multicultural countries, people of African descent typically are at the bottom of the economic rung, and they also experience a discrimination that does not protect children. And so children need special things to help them to survive and be healthy and thrive in highly racialized societies.
And I always love how you emphasize with us as a team that children having a positive racial identity is a part of their healthy and whole child development. And it's important. Our focus and emphasis is on Black children, but it's important for all children to have this, right?
Right.
Jamilla, question for you.
Yes.
Keeping the current racist, anti-critical race theory sentiment in mind, in your extensive experience of being a classroom teacher, curriculum developer, and administrator working with other educators, why is race and social justice important to integrate into educational settings? And what is your approach to doing that? And how do you encourage other educators to do so? And this is for Jamilla, but Aisha, feel free to chime in because I know you have things to say about this too.
Okay, so the my initial response to your first question as to like, why is it important to integrate is because it's already there. I think that the biggest fallacy is that it's not present when we know we live in America, we live in a racialized world. So to be delusional about race not being present in social justice or the lack thereof not being present in a school or in a classroom is really misguided thinking and not realistic. So the reason why I would approach it is because it is there and because it is yet another topic that leads to skills that students need to have as citizens of the world to be able to navigate effectively throughout the world. So one thing that comes into mind initially about this is, the school where I taught for a number of years was primarily an African-American school. And we had some graduates come back from their first quarter of college, and they were just really upset about the interactions that they had been experiencing with their white counterparts in undergrad. And, I had students reach out to me to ask me questions about like how to respond to some things, who should they go to talk to about some of the interactions and the aggressions and microaggressions that they were experiencing. But they knew to reach out to me after they had graduated because of the things that we read about and discussed when we were in class together, and how I was very adamant about folding all of those things into the learning that they did. So we didn't learn things in a vacuum. That's one thing, because it creates that connection. It gives them a space to call out things that they see and feel, put a name to it so that they'll be able to deal with it in a proactive and effective way that is not going to cause them any further harm. So they need to know that there are safe people to talk to about that are informed and will know how, be able to help guide them as to how to respond to these things, but also to be proactive with creating safe spaces where they might be in order to be able to have these discussions and be their own advocates. So I would say that's one reason why. It's also adding that, not to sound hokey, but adding that relevance to the things that they are engaging in. If you're asking students to do really tough, rigorous things, there has to be some type of a buy-in with it. There has to be a point to it. And if there's no point to it or buy-in or personal connection with it, then you only are going to see students who are good at playing the school game be engaged with whatever that particular learning experience is. So, it's a way of empowering them. It's in the same way that I feel that I was empowered by growing up in a household that was rich with, the brilliance of Black people and people of African descent across the globe. And not just across the globe during the present, but past and thinking toward the future too. So it was the experience that I had to help me to, really be so well grounded as a young person in a very racialized city of Pittsburgh, and also as a young person in a public school system that may not necessarily have seen me as being as brilliant as I was as a young person. I knew how smart I was. I didn't depend on a teacher ever to tell me whether I was smart or not, whether I had any particular skills or not, because of the way that I had been raised and what had been poured into me for too many years for them to be able to destroy it. And that's what happens. I'm using the words that are accurate. It's destroyed. When so many of our brilliant young people go into school and it gets chipped away year after year after year. And then we wonder why they don't want to come to school and why they don't want to engage in any of those other things. And I know I'm going on, but I'm so passionate about this and adamant about how important it is.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned, I think what Dr. Bettina Love, I think she called it soul killing, something like that in her book. And I also love how you mentioned, which is what how we strive to approach our work with Pride, that we try to encourage people to be able to respond as well as be proactive and then make it personal or find that personal connection. It seems like you had a dynamic relationship with your students, which allowed them to come to you with those kinds of concerns and that you were a wonderful resource for them. Dr. White, did you have anything you wanted to add to what Jamilla said?
I think Jamilla covered it all.
Okay. I know you have things about the anti-CRT sentiment. Did you want to say anything more about that?
I think the only thing that I would say is probably things that people already know, which is that this current, I guess you could say current version of it is just a replication of something that has a long history going back as far as the 1800s. So it comes in fits and spurts and waves. And when we see people becoming a lot more aware, conscious, active, then there's always people who are reactive and want to take us a step back. And so I think this is just another example of that.
That's right. There's that quote, whenever there's racial progress, it's followed by racial terror. And what you just mentioned, Dr. White, makes me think of the Daughters of the Confederacy. Everybody should look that up. Like Dr. White mentioned, this has been going on for a long time. This is nothing new. Were you going to say something, Jamilla?
No, yeah, it just reminds me of, Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen, and how he talked about that backlash after Reconstruction.
Yes.
and what that was, how that was just like the death of so many things that had been accomplished, but it was that reaction.
Right. Yeah. If anyone wants to know, a wonderful resource, if you have, I believe it's on PBS. There's a PBS documentary, I think it's 2 or 3 parts on Reconstruction, which talks about the terror and the backlash that followed Reconstruction, like Jamilla just mentioned.
And there's also a young adult novel, not novel, but a young adult version of the book that has been written by Henry Louis Gates. So he has both there's an adult version of the book, and there is also a young adult version.
Oh, what's the name of the book?
Oh, I have it on a bookshelf.
Okay, it's okay.
I'll look it up while someone else is talking, and I'll say it.
Okay. Well, as towards the end of what you were saying, Jamilla, about how you were raised, as I mentioned earlier, these Dr. White and Jamilla, you're both a dynamic mother-daughter duo. And one of the P.R.I.D.E program's components is work with parents and caregivers. And to my understanding, as Jamilla just mentioned, Dr. White, as a parent, created a home environment and had a parenting style that was what we like to call Pride-filled. So can you both talk about what that experience was like, if there are any memories that you can share, and some of the benefits of that? So I'll start with Dr. White.
Yeah, and I was going to try to put it on Jamilla again.
Jamilla's looking up a book.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying that, first of all, I was a young single parent, primarily throughout my parenting experience. So I think people need to understand that. And I think the reason that I say that is because it was the reality, but also it's an example of how you still can do it even when you are a single parent, even though it may be a lot harder to do it. And I often talk about how fortunate I was to encounter a group of Black radicals who were from Pittsburgh and other parts of the country, who get sort of just immerse me in this education around Black people, Black empowerment, Black pride. And so that had a huge influence on me. But I also would add that I think I was ripe for that because some of that was beginning when I was about to graduate from high school. And so with those, with that mindset of being open to learning more and wanting to learn more, and then having the opportunity to learn, it impacted my parenting. And so I had a really strong interest in helping my kids with things like reading. We always went to the library, single parent, no money, can go to the library. And Jamilla will tell you how many times we went to the library. So one example of that is, helping children to understand the importance of education, which is part of positive parenting, it's particularly for Black children. The other was having a home, I guess you can say, environment that celebrated Blackness. I can still remember this huge mural I made out of pictures from Ebony magazine, Essence magazine, and how it went all the way across the wall. And it was pictures of Black people from all parts of the world. And then also just being involved in activism. That meant that my kids always saw me in the living room having meetings with people to talk about organizing, being involved in organizations and going to protests and taking my kids to protests. Not always the safest thing to do, particularly once when we were arrested at an anti-apartheid demonstration. But, a variety of things. So educating my children, letting them see images that were positive, letting them see Black people who were intellectuals and who talked about important political issues, and then seeing me in action, actually, advocating for things that people needed and desired and deserved. I don't know if Jamilla wants to add anything.
There's so much to add. There really is. Like, I'm glad that you mentioned the meetings. Yeah, because we were always so used to either hosting meetings at the house or going to meetings at someone else's house or at a church or at some room at Pitt or wherever it might be. So we were always used to that, always used to protests, always used to, but then also it was that balance between that level of the activism, but then also an appreciation of the culture and art and music and things like that. So the artwork in the house always represented the Black diaspora, right? And, taking us to African Liberation Day in DC in that car. Oh my goodness. Did that car die on our way?
Yes.
Right? Who does that? Who takes two little kids in a janky car to DC for African Liberation Day? This lady, right? And it was such a great experience. I don't even remember the car conking out. I remember because she told us the story afterwards. What I remember most is how many Black people were at that. Where was it? Was that at the National Mall or at a park? I'm not sure exactly where it was. It was so beautiful. And I never forgot it. I always wanted to go back, so that we could experience it again. So because we did those things, we're so used to doing those things. So then as we became, young adults, we sought those things out ourselves. So whenever I would travel looking for these types of experiences and art exhibits and, music festivals and things like that to deepen my understanding of Black culture through the ages and across the globe. But I think that the other thing that I wanted to point out, because this is a thing maybe you might not even, I don't know, because I don't want to say you don't talk about it that much, Mom, you don't realize what you did. But not only, it wasn't just the steeping in the culture, but it was learning all the time. No matter what it was, she always asked questions, of us and engaged us with whatever we were experiencing. So it wasn't as if we were being talked at, or preached to. It was always an open dialogue or an interchange where she really wanted to know what we were thinking. And part of that is because you were reading those books on child psychology too, and trying to really mimic those things to be a great mom, even though you were so young. but it worked because it definitely shaped our perspective even of how to interact with young people. So you see it in the way that I might interact with students. And then you see it in the way that, my brother interacts with his children. It's not really so directive, but really just trying to get to know them as individuals and learning who they are so you can match the right experiences to them and help grow them.
Those were just some beautiful jewels that y'all just dropped. I feel like that's going to be my favorite part of the show. And it was just so important to have that conversation, especially for some of our listeners who are parents and caregivers, just knowing that planting those seeds early, you don't always know how and when they're going to bloom, but they're going to bloom. They can bloom. So, and I just love also how Dr. White, you just created this immersive experience where it was pride-filled in the home, it was pride-filled in community spaces, pride-filled, educationally. So, kind of everywhere that you went, you tried to have that essence of pride and instilling a sense of positive racial identity and Black brilliance and knowledge and appreciation of history and culture into your children in a way that wasn't, I think you would say, wasn't didactic.
I was thinking didactic.
Yes, I got that word from Dr. White. And how it just stimulates thinking and conversation and nurturing their inquisitive nature. So that was just beautiful. Did you want to add something, Aisha?
Well, the only thing I wanted to add was that, this was something that didn't only happen when my kids were younger. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, when I was involved with the Harambe Black Arts Festival, both of my kids were employed by the art festival. And so those experiences extended into their teenage years.
Earlier in the conversation with when Dr. White talked about the origin of Pride and how it all started with an article. So you're both practitioners, educators, and scholars who value research. So if you could name one useful or foundational research article and or a resource that informs the work you do, what would it be?
Yeah. So I first interpreted this question as as a question about resources that might be useful to others who are listeners. And I actually came up with four different ones, 4 different genres. The first is an article, is not an actual study, but it's a collection of research, and it's our go-to article that we always recommend to people who are first encountering Pride, and that's Children Are Not Colorblind by Dr. Aaron Winkler. So it's an article. And
I knew that one was going to be in there.
Right. And then a video that I recommend is the TED Talk by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, where she's talking about her son questioning her about being brown skinned. Is my skin brown because I drink chocolate milk? And then a book for practitioners that, full disclosure, I've read the beginning, but I haven't finished reading it. It's called Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Biased Classrooms. And that's a fairly new book by Ioma Aruka, Stephanie Currington, Tanya Durden, and Carrie Ann Eskai. And then the last recommendation is a film, and that is the film that's also about anti-bias curriculum. It's called Reflecting on Anti-Bias Education in Action, the Early Years. So I would recommend all 4 of those resources.
Thank you, Dr. White. Jamilla?
Yeah, so I don't have the different articles teed up, but when I was thinking about this question, what it made me think about is what were some of the beginning texts that really helped to inform my whole approach to the way that I design learning experiences that are pride filled for the different students who might be within my classes. And so the first book was, of course, by the late Bell Hooks, and that's Teaching to Transgress. And I do believe that that book was introduced to me first by Dr. White. But I have it, and it's still my go-to in order to remember the why behind what I'm doing. And the other book is a fairly recent one that I have just been like singing the praises of, because it really speaks to the way that I did approach designing, teaching, and learning when I was in the classroom. And that is like culturally relevant teaching in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's culturally responsive teaching in the brain, right? I always end up
those two R's are tricky.
transposing the words. Look,
That's
I
like
have the
Zanetta
book.
Hammond.
Yep.
Yeah.
Culturally, I made sure to have the books with me so that I wouldn't forget the titles. But yeah, culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And just the whole introduction where she talks about how, students are might not be able to do certain things or even think critically because that's what we taught them.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not something that's inherent in our students. And I always knew that it wasn't something that was inherent in our students because of the way that I was raised. However, not everybody has that experience. And so if they fix their minds to think, oh, they're that way because they're Black,
Mm-hmm.
then they're going to have lower expectations of what students know or are able to know or can do or are able to learn how to do. Belief is such an important part of being able to be a dynamic teacher. You have to believe in students before anybody in their entire lives believes in them. Because that's the only way that it can happen. And if you don't believe, then you're not going to attempt. So I would say those two books in particular. And then there's another book that I had to look up. And it's like a dark horse, like you would not think it's this book that really helped to inform it. And the title of this book is Teaching English So It Matters. And it is by Deborah Stern. And I think it was published like in the early 90s. Yeah, 1994. So yes, I'm dating myself in the teaching career. But I came across this book by chance at one of the university libraries when I was doing additional studies. And I just completely fell in love with it because it was written by a woman who I believe taught in Chicago public schools. And she just talked about how important it was to not just have thematic units that related to students' lived experiences, but also co-creating learning experiences. And so I was introduced to the whole concept of co-creating just by coming across a book. And it changed my whole trajectory of teaching, because ever since I found that, I did not ever teach the same exact thing any successive years, no matter how many times I taught 11th grade or 12th grade or 6th through 8, like never did the exact same scope and sequence. It was always maybe a couple of things that we would read together, but we never did the same exact activities with those things too, because I customized according to the students who were in front of me. And constantly listening to them to see what are some of the things that they like, what are some of the things they don't like, listening to them when they might say something that might be ill-informed in terms of race or a class, and then making sure to tie something in to the learning experience that made them think differently about something that they thought they knew.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, one year, one of the go-to books that we read all the time with 11th grade was Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And there is a chapter in that novel that alludes to the Emmett Till murder.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a barbershop conversation, and so you have to kind of read between the lines, which is like how barbershop conversations are if you're not a part of it. And so we read that chapter, but then also I folded in a mini unit that related to the backstory of Emmett Till, and so getting them to learn about it by looking at that clip from Eyes on the Prize, and then reading articles about race and sex and where these thoughts were coming from, or where these philosophy about that drove these men to kill this young boy came from, and being able to discuss it, and using tools to get them to really engage with text and then make connections to it. And so those were all of the rich experiences that we were able to have by making all of those connections and giving them alternate texts to look at depending on questions that they might ask while we're reading. So I was just constantly responsive, but I got that methodology from this book that I found in my very first year teaching.
Wow. I love how you talked about your approach in regards to the content, integrating kind of current events or historical events that connected to the young people that you were teaching. And I love how you mentioned a little while back, believing in your students. I remember having a teacher at Berkeley High who I will always remember. He's my favorite #1 educator in our Africana Studies department in the Black psychology class, Mr. Davis. And I was a quiet student, but I did well in the class, but I didn't have that belief in myself. And he saw something in me that I didn't yet see in myself. Right. And so he pushed me, he encouraged me, he had high expectations. That's something that's, recommended with educators as well. Have high expectations of your students, more than I thought that I could accomplish. And those seeds really planted in me kind of who I am today and some of the work that I'm doing today based on that educator believing in me and having high expectations of me, creating an environment where I was able to learn about myself, learn about my people, and exert and develop my skills. So I can totally connect to what you're saying. This concludes part 1 of our 2-part episode featuring Dr. Aisha White and Jamilla Rice. Tune in to the next episode for more insights and best practices from them that you don't want to miss. I'm your host, Medina Jackson.